This video is going to overview the individual videos in the playlist on protists. And obviously, as I go through this quickly, if any of these were of greater interest to you, you could watch the individual videos. So if you were to look at all of the groups of life on Earth today, and then ask if we were to split Earth's history into its eons, the Hadean, the Archean, the Proterozoic, and the Phanerozoic, when did the various groups of life exist in Earth's history? One would find that all of the animals have only existed, say, recently, mostly in this purple last 500 million years, a little earlier than that. And so that the world has not always looked the way it does today. And so most of the life that we think of, the plants, the animals, the fungi, et cetera, they're more recent. For about a third of the history of life, the only living things on planet Earth were bacteria, the prokaryotic cells. So not only are they the simplest form of life today and the most common form of life today, they were also the first form of life. But around 2 billion years ago, something happened. In part because the blue-green algae, the cyanobacteria, were releasing oxygen into the air. A new group of living things evolved, most of which now utilize this oxygen, and we call them the protists. Now, as I'll get to at the very end, protist turns out not to be a very good biological group, but to try to come up with a better biological group would be fairly complicated. So protist is what kind of we agree to disagree about. So let's use that term, and at the end, I'll mention why biologists aren't thrilled with referring to protists as a group. So protists appear 2 billion years ago for the first time. And then from the protists, then evolved the plants, animals, and fungi. So the ancestral protists are not only the ancestors of, say, amoeba and paramecia and other simple organisms today, but also of the plants, animals, and fungi, which are larger, multicellular, etc. Now, the reason we say that, the reason that we would lump life together and to form this group called eukaryotes, which excludes bacteria. So notice out of all of the living things here, all of these living things are eukaryotes, including the yeast, but bacteria are not. And the reason is that eukaryotes just have so many things that bacteria lack. So the first eukaryotes had new traits, and that modern eukaryotes share them. So look at how this amoeba is moving, how it extends its cytoskeleton and forms these little pseudopods it flows into. Well, human white blood cells move in the same way. See the cilia on this one-celled protist? We have cilia lining the trachea, the oviduct, which move in the same way. So there's a very long list of features that eukaryotes share, whether they be simple one-celled organisms or organisms such as ourselves. So we have a nucleus that holds our chromosomes. Our cell division we call mitosis, where the nucleus divides through prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase, through these stages. Bacteria don't do that. These microtubules, which help the cells divide, and also which compose the cilia and the flagella, these are things which are unique to eukaryotes. I could go on and on. There are genes that eukaryotes share that higher eukaryotes may use in muscle or in immune systems, but nevertheless simple forms of these genes exist in single-celled organisms. So 2 billion years ago, there arose a new type of cell on Earth, the eukaryotic cell. In general, it is larger, more complex. It has a nucleus. It has membrane-bound organelles like the endoplasmic reticulum and the mitochondria, and that the single-celled organisms like these euglena are the descendants of the first eukaryotic cells. But so too, in addition to the modern protists, plants, fungi, and animals are made of eukaryotic cells. So there are two types of cells on Earth. The prokaryotic cell is what composes the bacteria. Eukaryotic cells include the more complex organisms. Now, how could this, larger, more complex type of cell evolve? Well, one thing is clear. The process of endosymbiosis, which then becomes important, throughout other groups in this list, again, because this has happened multiple times. So here we have a cell with a nucleus. I'll talk about the nucleus in a second. And it can eat a smaller cell, just like today there are hunters, like, lions and wolves can eat other animals. There are predatory cells. So amoeba and ciliates, etc., they can eat other cells. They can perform phagocytosis. So they can take a little cell inside them, like this blue-green algae, and then they can digest it, rip it to pieces, just like you would do in your stomach, to what you eat today. And then that's how this cell nourishes itself. So that obviously is known to happen. This is how many of the predatory protists then make their living. They ingest a smaller cell inside themselves, and then they break it down for food. But it turns out there is something else that can happen upon occasion. When the smaller cell is taken into the larger cell, sometimes the larger cell doesn't digest it. Now, one of the things that can happen is the smaller cell could actually want to be inside the larger cell and be a parasite that then feeds on the larger cell. So sometimes this interaction occurs and the larger cell eats the smaller cell, so it benefits. Sometimes the smaller cell is a parasite inside the larger cell, so the smaller cell benefits. But sometimes they both benefit, in that the smaller cell gets something out of the larger cell, maybe a place to live, maybe nutrients of some sort. But then maybe the smaller cell does a task that benefits the larger cell that it could not do by itself, like perform photosynthesis or use oxygen to break down the components of food, which the larger cell cannot do. Either way now, there could be a stable, permanent relationship where this smaller cell lives inside the bigger cell in a symbiotic relationship in which they both benefit. Symbiosis is when there's a mutually beneficial relationship, and endosymbiosis is the process by which there's a mutually beneficial relationship in which one organism is living inside the other. So here you have an endosymbiont, a cell living inside a larger cell in a relationship where they both benefit. Now, when we ask where did the eukaryotic cell come from, that might be where the nucleus came from. All right, the nucleus is DNA wrapped in a membrane, so maybe there's a bit of a cell living inside of another cell going on there. Maybe not, because there are actually some bacteria known which can wrap their chromosome in a membrane. And so if you ask, how is it that now there's a new kind of cell that wraps its DNA in a membrane? Well, some bacteria actually do that. So maybe that's not, something that the eukaryotes, that make them special or that they had to invent. It could have been inherited from a bacterial ancestor, or maybe a cell lives inside another cell. So there are actually a couple different ways that perhaps the nucleus came about. But if you were to ask, where do mitochondria come from? Those are organelles inside our cells that use oxygen to break down food. So if you ask, why am I breathing oxygen? It's because the mitochondria of your body need oxygen to break down food. That's the only thing you're really using oxygen for, oxygen gas. And so we have mitochondria, all animals do, but plants, fungi, and protists have mitochondria as well. And then chloroplasts are obviously what make plants look green. This is where photosynthesis occurs. But it's important that in a plant cell, the whole cell isn't green, and the whole cell doesn't do photosynthesis. It's just these green bags. But if you were to look closer at chloroplasts and mitochondria, you notice something fascinating. They are the size of bacteria. They are the shape of bacteria. They divide the way that bacteria do through fission, not through the mitosis, the way the rest of the cell does. They actually have their own chromosome, which is weird. Not all of the chromosomes are in the nucleus. You have chromosomes in your mitochondria. So you actually have 47 chromosomes, 46 in your nucleus, a 47th in your mitochondria. The chromosomes of mitochondria and chloroplast are circular like bacteria, not rod-shaped like your nuclear ones. They have a slightly different genetic code. They are resistant, they're affected by the same antibiotics which kill bacteria. In other words, what I'm saying is there are free-living bacteria that look like this and like this. Mitochondria and chloroplasts seem to be descended from free-living bacteria that learn to live inside larger cells. There's all of these features that mitochondria and chloroplasts share with bacteria. And so therefore, if we were to ask, why 2 billion years ago was there a new type of cell that had not previously existed? The answer seems to be that there were endosymbiotic relationships where cells adapted to live inside other cells. And this then created a new kind of cell, the eukaryotic cell, that is not only the ancestor of amoeba and algae alive today, but also of plants, fungi, and animals, which are composed of eukaryotic cells. Now, as I go through this, and I'll mention this again, so these green cyanobacteria are what make green algae look green, and even green plants look green. But it turns out that in addition to the endosymbiosis events, which gave rise to mitochondria and these green chloroplasts, it seems that more have occurred later in history that now are restricted to one group of protists. So when we ask why are the golden brown algae golden brown, well, they have another endosymbiont that's different from these two. Why are some euglenozoans green but most aren't? Well, they've had a separate endosymbiosis. And so cells living inside other cells for mutual benefit, that's happened a bunch of times, even in the animals. So corals are animals, but they do photosynthesis. There's actually a number of animals which do photosynthesis. How can animals perform photosynthesis? Well, they can if they have algae living inside them as endosymbionts. And so we'll get back to this topic later. So 2 billion years ago, there was a new kind of cell. So 2 billion years ago, there's a new kind of cell. This eukaryotic cell that is so different from bacteria in so many ways. And I have that in the video, so I'll just do this last one. So for example, what you're seeing here is what one of your white blood cells can do to a bacteria. It can perform phagocytosis or cell eating. All right, but this requires you to have not only internal membrane organelles like these lysosomes, which will help in the digestion, but also a flexible cytoskeleton made of actin and myosin, which allows you to reach out these pseudopods. Actin and myosin, well, what can be organized to form muscle cells in the animals. Only eukaryotes have this. And so, the eukaryotic cell then is, has a whole lot of new features. Now, plants, animals, and fungi can be covered later. What I'd like to cover now is the protists. These are the eukaryotes which are not plants, animals, and fungi. Now, this will make more sense by the end. But if you were to say, all right, well, the protists, if they're a family tree, all right, so that all protists are related to all eukaryotes are related to each other, having descended from the first eukaryotes, let's look at a family tree. And it turns out there's an awful lot of branches because there's an awful lot of these protist eukaryotes. And it's complicated. Land plants have descended from green algae. So here land plants are over here. Fungi have descended from a different branch of the eukaryote family tree. They're related to microsporidians, which are over here. Animals have descended from eukaryotes, and they're closely related to CHOANOFLAGELLATES. So here's the family tree. And even though we want to talk about animals, fungi, and plants later, there's all of these other branches. So I have videos that go through these individually. What I'd like to do is just kind of hit some highlights of what you find in the great Protistan family tree. One is, I'd like to go down here and start off with Giardia. Now, Giardia, forgive me, I have a bias. When I was in the Peace Corps, I had Giardia for the better part of 2 years. And so, you know, personal relationship with this intestinal parasite. One of the reasons we treat our water is that we want to avoid Giardia in our water supply. Now, Giardia looks a little messy, so it isn't, you know, if you were trying to identify it, it is a little bit harder than identifying many of the other protists. The reason that Giardia is especially interesting is it seems to be a representative of one of the most primitive branches of the eukaryotic family tree. So if you're asking what eukaryote is the least changed from the ancestral condition, Giardia is, at least at present, the best candidate that we have. So it doesn't have mitochondria per se, but it has things that kind of have some of the features of mitochondria. So seemingly this lineage arose after the endosymbiosis that would produce mitochondria, but before those endosymbiotic bacteria actually changed and then took on the features of mitochondria. The fact that they can all live in low oxygen conditions may be a leftover from having evolved in a world where there wasn't much oxygen left yet. Unfortunately, with many of these protists, we can argue about where they should be classified. We can argue about whether they're sexual or not. So as far as I know, the last I've read, we can't definitely say that, you know, we can observe Giardia undergoing sexual reproduction, but it seems to have some of the genes for sexual reproduction. So does it just do it rarely and we haven't observed it yet? Did it once do it and it's lost the ability? So rather than get into all the weeds about Giardia, this is our best candidate for the most primitive lineage of protists, branching off from the family tree of the rest of them before many of the changes occurred. And now let me just kind of start going through some of the other groups, even in, you know, perhaps a random order, simply because there is, you know, disagreement about, you know, how, you know, different groups should be classified. So here is a group called the euglenozoans. And a couple of interesting things is, one, notice that they move. Bacteria, they don't typically move like this. And the reason is that here you can see euglena have a flagella, a very long microtubule structure, which allows them to swim. Actually, to be technically true, there's actually two flagella, this big one and then a little one in here that allows them to steer. And so this one-celled organism can swim using its flagella. Now you might ask, wait, don't bacteria have flagella? Don't even some archaea have flagella? Yes, but it's completely different. So even though we use the same term flagellum, the proteins are different. They have nothing in common with each other. So the bacterial flagella is nothing like the eukaryotic flagella. But now eukaryotic flagella are all homologous. So when you look at the flagella on, say, animal sperm or plant sperm, the primitive plants have swimming sperm, they are the same type of flagellum as this euglena has. So flagella for locomotion, that's interesting. Now, many of these euglenozoans, here you can see euglenozoans, they are heterotrophs, chemoheterotrophs, which are getting their chemicals and their organic carbon from other living things. So for example, this is a beautiful picture, but it's also frightening because this is human blood, and this is a euglenozoan, which shouldn't be in human blood. This is a parasite. So there are diseases such as sleeping sickness and Chagas disease, which are caused by euglenozoans, which are then parasites inside the human body. So as a parasite, it's getting its energy and it's getting its organic carbon from humans, the host. So it's a chemoheterotroph. Chemo getting its energy from other things, heterotroph getting its carbon and sugars for carbon for sugars, proteins, etc., from other living things. So it's a chemoheterotroph. But now this one looks green. And if you can look here, you can see the whole cell's not green. The greenness of it is because it has these green bags inside of it. So because the majority of euglenozoans are not photosynthetic, but some of them are, thanks to these green membrane-bound organelles, it seems that yet another endosymbiosis occurred long after the original ones, which gave rise to early eukaryotes. This one arose within the euglenozoan lineage, so that most euglenozoans aren't photosynthetic, but some are. All right, and so there are both phototrophs in the euglenozoans that can get their energy from the sun, and then the chemoheterotrophs, which can't. So euglenozoans, that is one group of protists. But wait, there's more. And once again, I'd just like to, offer a survey with some of the videos of different kinds of protists, with maybe some interesting features of each one. All right. So swimming around are the little paramecia, which are ciliates, which we will get back to. And they are then food for that large amoeba. So here's a big amoeba. It intends on eating those swimming ciliates. And the way it does is, as I said, it can modify its cytoskeleton. So it can kind of take apart its skeleton on one side and then rebuild it on another and kind of flow into itself. And as it does so, it's reaching out these pseudopods, these false feet, and then enclosing these ciliates, which then it ingests for food. So inside, you'll see that there's all of these membrane bags, many of which then have some of these swimming ciliates, which are being digested for food. Now, couple things that mark this eukaryotic cell. It's clearly different from a bacterium. It's so much bigger. It's much more complex. Look at all the internal membrane-bound organelles. Look at all the stuff going on inside. Bacteria just aren't that complex on the inside. Look at how it moves by reorganizing its actin cytoskeleton. Bacteria can't do that. Our white blood cells can. And so when we consider, once again, eukaryotes share this ability to have amoeboid cells, which can move in this fashion, which can perform phagocytosis, and engulf larger things. Eukaryotic cells share the features of having these, more complex internal membrane-bound organelles. Here you can see some paramecia, which are being ingested, or almost ingested. So this thing is trying to enclose them in vesicles here where they can be used for food. And so this is an amoeba. Now, amoebas vary. Most of them are, predators, as you can see here, taking in other cells. But a couple can be parasites. So, for example, there is an amoebic dysentery that humans can suffer from. And so, this is a big group, just like, say, arthropods are a big group of animals. Amoeba are a big group of protists that can vary a great deal. Now, some are smaller than others. Some are so big that they can actually be seen without a microscope. So this one has this really cool name, Chaos. This is a prepared slide, so you won't see it moving. But this is so big that it can actually measure a couple of millimeters, and you can see it without a microscope. So some cells are so big that you can see them without a microscope. Now you can see there's all of these internal bags, where perhaps it was engulfing its prey, its the ciliates, but you can see the irregular shapes because of how this can then modify its cytoskeleton and move. Right. So those amoebas then move in a different way than the euglenozoans, which had a flagellum. Here is another way to move. There's a group of protists which are known as the ciliates, and they then surround themselves not with one or two long, or not with one or two flagella, one longer, maybe one for steering, but rather with lots of little hairs, which we call cilia. Cilia and flagella, they're the same structure. They have the same structure, the same protein, etc. Just the difference is flagella tend to be very long, and there tend to be like one or a small number of flagella, whereas cilia, there are a lot of them. So this paramecium, it is a ciliate because it's covered with cilia. But notice it's a eukaryotic cell. It's bigger than bacteria. It has lots of internal membrane-bound organelles. Now, some of these would be food it's ingesting. This large one, it can also then have vacuoles which excrete water. So if this thing is living in fresh water, the problem is that fresh water may want to come into the cell, going from an area of high concentration to low, which would potentially burst the cell. So paramecia can kind of collect, the fresh water and then spit it out. And so here you can see there's all of these cilia covering the outside of the cell. And this is interesting because, once again, we're eukaryotes, and some of our cells have cilia. So the cells of our trachea have cilia beating just like this. The cells which line the oviduct have cilia which beat like that. Now, the eukaryotes, they did invent sexual reproduction. And so eukaryotes can have sex. Some of them don't. Giardia, we're not quite sure. The euglenozoans, it turns out they don't have sex. Another group, the dinoflagellates, they don't have sex. But most protist lineages are capable of sexual reproduction. However, it can be more complicated. All right, not to go into this here. I have a separate video that does this, as you can see here. But when ciliates reproduce sexually, it involves a macronucleus, a micronucleus, which gets swapped. It's the micronucleus which undergoes meiosis. So it's more complicated, but it is nevertheless sexual reproduction, just a variant on it. Now, ciliates are quite diverse. Paramecia, it's a very common organism, and it's easy to observe in labs, so a lot of people are familiar with those. But ciliates are huge. Now, once again, just like arthropods are a phylum, and crabs are different, from insects, or just like mollusks are a phylum, and a snail is different from an octopus. Ciliates are a phylum, all right? And so we shouldn't be surprised then that not all ciliates look like paramecia. Just like there are variations in arthropods and variations in mollusks, there are certainly variations in these ciliates. So I have a number of videos here which can go through some of these ciliates in greater degree. Some of them are huge and can be seen without a microscope. Some of them can have cilia on part of their cells, but not others. Some are elongate, and actually they're so big and elongate that you might actually consider them to be worms, unless you look closely and saw the cilia on the outside of themselves. Some can be green. All right, and they actually then have algae living inside them. All right, and so as I had said, endosymbiosis has occurred a lot of times, and so you may have a group of protists which is primarily getting their energy from feeding on smaller cells, so they're predators. But nevertheless, you could have some members of the group that developed an endosymbiotic relationship with algae. And so now there's algae living inside them. Now, these could then be entirely photosynthetic, all right, so they don't hunt anymore, or they could do both. So here's a ciliate. Notice it does have some green algae living inside of it. And so it could be what's called a mixotroph. So it is capable of getting, its energy both by hunting other organisms and eating other cells, but then also through photosynthesis. So as far as lifestyles, it doesn't have to be an either or. You're a predator or you're a producer. It can actually be both. And then there is one ciliate, which is also then known to be a human parasite. All right, and so oh, come on, sorry. And so forgive me before I talk about the parasite, on the endosymbionts, some actually destroy coral animals which have endosymbionts in them, but then ingest their endosymbionts. And so just as the animals were doing photosynthesis because of the algae living inside them, these paramecia can then take those algae and then do the same. And there is a human parasite which is caused by a ciliate. And so getting back to the reproduction in ciliates, they can reproduce sexually, and they can then also reproduce asexually. And that's common in these protists, where there may be benefits of reproducing asexually under certain conditions and then sexually under other conditions. So they are capable of both. So here you see what's called fission. That's asexual reproduction in ciliates. Here you see conjugation, where they're swapping their micronuclei. This then is sexual reproduction. Some ciliates and other organisms anchor to the substrate, to stay fixed in one place. So there can be, some sort of a stalk or a structure which fixates them. So here is a ciliate, but notice how it is anchored to the substrate. And it moves the minute the internet catches up. So once again, this is a phylum of organisms, and just like arthropods or the chordates, including the vertebrates, vary, we shouldn't then be surprised to see there's significant variation, whether it be in size, in lifestyle of these ciliates as well. Right, and so this one can sometimes pull back and on its stalk. Right. So I'm just going to move forward. That one spirostomum it's huge. It's big enough to see without a microscope. And once again, if you didn't know any better, you might think you were looking at a microscopic worm. So there are worm-like protists, which are made of one cells, and there are microscopic worms, which are animals made of many cells, and they can actually be about the same size. Right. So that was another way of moving. And different groups of protists can move, and I will focus on one more type of movement in just a little bit. But let me just once again start doing this introduction to the diversity here. So there are some protists which have decided to encase themselves in a solid protective casing, which can be called a test in some groups, a frustule in others. So think of the difference, say, between a slug and a snail. A slug and a snail, they're the same thing, except that the snail now has this shell that it encloses itself in. Well, some microscopic organisms, some protists, then make a shell. So when you saw the amoeba, there are things that look like amoeba. They kind of have that shape. They can change their skeleton, but nevertheless, they make a shell around themselves. One of those groups is called the FORAMINIFERANS. So in life, there are amoeba-like organisms that then make a shell, usually out of calcium carbonate, although there are other groups, and even the primitive ones use chitin, which is interesting. So they make this calcium carbonate shell. It typically has multiple chambers, which is different from the other groups which make calcium carbonate, or which makes shells. And so foraminiferans are amoeboid organisms that make a shell around themselves out of calcium carbonate. Now, just one quick thought. Every now and then, you might be looking at places to vacation, and you might see an ad who's like, "Oh, this island has these beautiful pink sand beaches." That's not sand. That's actually the shells of foraminiferans. And so, how common are these? They can be very common. Common to the point where, when you're looking at islands, what you think is sand is to a large group here. So not only are the foraminiferans amoeboid organisms, but so too is another group called the radiolarins. Radiolarians, I think, is the proper one. I think I have radiolarins here, I'm sorry. And so here, their shell is made of silica, so it's glassy. And in life, what would happen is those pseudopods would extend through holes in this glassy coating. All right, and so while foraminiferans are making an outer a casing of calcium carbonate, it's silica in these radiolarians. And once again, you can have the cytoplasmic extensions, reaching through pores. Now, both of these groups are primarily hunters, all right, where they would, feed on other things. But then there are variations. Some of them might have algae living inside them as endosymbionts, and so they would then be capable of doing photosynthesis as well. So once again, it's easy to find, say microscope slides of the hard outer casing, just as you can go to the beach and find the empty seashells that once had snails in them. Here, it's easy to find the empty silica casings of radiolarins, or the empty calcium carbonate casings of foraminiferans. But in life, they would have had those extensions coming from them. There are a lot more. So I'll try to go through these quickly. So there's another group of algae called the dinoflagellates. They are fascinating, and I have a number of videos on them. However, I'm just going to hit some of the highlights here. They can move. They have two flagella. One goes kind of around their organism, and then one kind of extends from it to help, so they can not only swim but also steer. And so they also then have a hard outer casing. They're fascinating for a number of reasons, some of which is genetic. They have a lot more DNA than you'd think they would. They just have a huge, like the quantity of DNA per cell is enormous. They even then have a variant of one of the DNA nucleotides. So that's certainly weird. They are sometimes called golden brown algae. I don't like to use that term because golden brown algae can actually be used by different individuals to refer to multiple groups or a subgroup of one, but they can have plastids inside them, which give them pigment and let them do photosynthesis. So like I said, a typical alga might have like this much DNA per cell, but some of these dinoflagellates have that much, right? That's incredible. And so some of these in each cell actually have more nucleotides than human cells do. So just weird. So here's just the great diversity of them. Now, how do they live? Well, they vary. Some of them are hunters, where they go around and do phagocytosis of other cells. Some of them have algae living inside them, these symbionts, and thus they can do photosynthesis. Quite often they can do both. All right, and so they can eat other cells and get energy that way. They can do photosynthesis and get energy that way. One of the reasons that dinoflagellates are so important is that dinoflagellates are the endosymbionts inside coral. Coral are animals, but they perform photosynthesis, and thus they get energy from sunlight and then can make these reefs. Corals wouldn't be able to make reefs if it wasn't for the photosynthesis, which I think gives them about 90% of their energy. Well, it's actually the dinoflagellates in the coral animals which give them the not only their pigments, but also let them do the photosynthesis, which lets them construct these reefs. The dinoflagellates inside the coral animal cells are called zooxanthellae, but they are endosymbionts. There are other ways in which dinoflagellates are significant as well. They can sometimes increase in great numbers, but this then is a problem for humans who want to swim in that area, because they can produce what are called red tides, which actually, because of a toxin that they produce can actually be lethal. So you might want to swim at a certain beach on vacation where reserve something, and then the beach is closed because there's a red tide. You shouldn't swim there. You could die. Actually, there could even be a danger if you're ingesting, say, shellfish, which ate a lot of these dinoflagellates, because once again, there's toxins and we can get sick from that as well. Some of these dinoflagellates can also be bioluminescent. So in many places in the Caribbean, Puerto Rico and Bahamas and others, there can be bays where there's bioluminescent algae that at night you can see them kind of glow bluish as the water is agitated. Those are dinoflagellates. We can talk about this in a different topic, but as we look at the major threats facing the world, one of them is the bleaching of coral. Right, so coral reefs, support an enormous percentage of the marine fish life, but climate change, the acidification of the oceans, and other changes are causing these coral animals to lose their dinoflagellate endosymbionts. And so therefore, as they lose these pigmented algae, then the coral bleaches. Look at all these white spots here where they're no longer living coral animals. This is bleached coral. And it doesn't have anywhere near the diversity of fish that the healthy corals do. So dinoflagellates, they are an important group of protists. And once again, coral reefs are to a large extent dependent on these dinoflagellates. Some of them are free living. So here's a free living dinoflagellate here. But then some of them can be parasites as well. And so like if you have an aquarium or you're studying the diseases of fish, there can be, in addition to free living dinoflagellates like this one, there can be parasitic dinoflagellates like this one, and this is the cells of a fish. So here you can see a parasitic dinoflagellate living on a fish. Okay. Next major group of protists are the diatoms. Okay. I apologize. When I started teaching, general biology too, I tried to figure out how would be the best way to, teach about these. And so I had a lot of videos where there was a human narrating, and looking back, I'm not quite sure that was always the best choice. So, some of these videos, you didn't quite need the human to be narrating on about diatoms. Diatoms are a form of photosynthetic algae. They are so important that it is thought that when we look at photosynthesis, the oxygen which is produced by diatoms is equal to the oxygen produced by all of the world's rainforest. So there is an incredible amount of photosynthesis that occurs here. So they're very important in aquatic food chains, very important in sequestering carbon and producing oxygen as well. Most are marine, but you can find diatoms living in freshwater and even moist soil. And as you can see here, they can actually move. How can they move? Well, here's another form of movement. So amoebas, they can extend their skeletons, and change their shape. Euglenozoans and others have flagella. The ciliates have the short cilia. But this dinoflagellate can release a secretion, a mucus-like substance, and then as it reabsorbs, it kind of glide along the surface. And so this is moving without cilia or flagella, and not in the same way that the amoebas are moving. It has another form where it's gliding along a secretion of its own synthesis. And so diatoms can move in their own way. Diatoms can also be called golden brown algae like others, because instead of, say, chlorophyll, which is green, their plastid symbionts can have fucoxanthin, which gives them more of a golden brown color. I had mentioned before that many protists can reproduce both sexually and asexually. Most diatom reproduction is asexual. The problem is, if we were to look at the hard casing, which is made of silica, so not only do radiolarians make a casing of silica, but so too do diatoms make a glassy casing of silica. If you know what a petri dish is, that house bacteria, it's kind of a casing where there's two halves, where one fits inside the other. One is smaller than the other. So the frustule of diatoms has that feature where there's a smaller half which fits inside the larger half. And when diatoms reproduce asexually, what happens is these two halves split, and then each half then makes a smaller half. So what was once the bigger half now makes a copy of the original smaller half, so it's the same size. But the other one started off with the smaller half of the first cell, and now it makes a still smaller half to fit inside it. And so now this was asexual reproduction, and now new halves of the frustule are made. All right, and so this asexual reproduction can go on and go on and go on. The problem is one of the lineages then is going to get smaller and smaller. If every time the smaller half then makes a copy which is smaller still, at a certain point then it's just too small. And at that point then the diatoms then undergo meiosis and have sex. So in meiosis, which I'll get to at the end, you produce haploid cells, and sorry that the flagella dissociated. You produce haploid cells with half the number of chromosomes. They can have flagella and be swimming. They don't have to. And so now the diatom decided, I'm too small and it's time to reproduce sexually. So it undergoes meiosis. These meiotic cells then fuse. Two haploid cells then fuse to make a new diploid cell. This diploid cell then makes a new frustule with a normal-sized outer and two halves, an epitheca and a hypotheca, and now the process can begin again. So this sexual reproduction is kind of a way to rescue it from a scenario where one half is just getting too small. Once again, the cell wall of diatoms is made of silica, and it comes in these two halves, kind of fitting together the way kind of, say, a petri dish would. So diatoms extremely important. Many are single as they are free living, but then some of them are colonial. And so here you'll see slides. So here's a free living diatom. Notice the glassy appearance we see from the silica, but notice that some of them are colonial, where you can just see whole stacks of them. So here's a colony where, if you once again imagine petri dishes, so there would be a diatom, then another one on top of it, another one, living to form this colony. So diatoms are protists. And there's more. Protists are actually quite, diverse. I'm going to start, winding down soon. One group includes the parasite which causes malaria. Now, malaria years ago, when I was younger, was estimated to kill about 1 million people per year. the largest single disease caused in the world. Now, for example, other diseases like diarrhea can kill more than that, but diarrhea can be caused by multiple different organisms. And so luckily, the death toll is going down. It's now only about half that last I checked, so maybe 500,000 people succumb to malaria per year. But it is one of the major sources of mortality. And here you see a human red blood cell, but inside it are other cells living. So you may remember, earlier I had said that sometimes cells can live inside other cells, but they are now parasites. So here you can see the protist known as Plasmodium. This is the cause of malaria. It is a parasite living inside the human cells. Now it has a complex life cycle. Part of its life cycle is inside, say, the bloodstream of humans. Then it completes other parts of its life cycle inside the mosquito, which can transmit it, from one to another. And so this video goes through that complex life cycle. But once again, if you see human red blood cells with those structures inside them, that's the protist, which causes malaria. We have protists, which we refer to as algae. Algae is kind of a deceptive term because, using say, oh, that's an alga, it kind of suggests that all of the algae form a biological group and are related to each other. But that is not true. Algae do not form a biological group. The groups which we call algae include some which are unrelated to each other. So green algae are cousins of red algae, but they're not closely related. Neither of those two is related at all to brown algae. And then if we're going to ask, well, who are the algae? Well, obviously, as I've said, you can include diatoms in that mix. You can include dinoflagellates in that mix, but these are not related. And then, as we've said, there can be say ciliates, which perform photosynthesis. There can be euglenozoans, which perform photosynthesis. And so there's a lot of different kinds of algae, and they aren't necessarily closely related at all. So here I pick the three, bigger groups, because they can be multicellular: green algae, brown algae, and red algae. And I'm just comparing them. So green algae are primarily freshwater. Brown algae and red algae are more commonly saltwater. Some of them can include endosymbionts. So green algae can live inside other organisms. Some can include parasites. So there are even a few red algae which are parasitic. There are a few green algae which are parasitic. They can vary in the pigment, which lets them capture light and makes them colorful. So green algae have chlorophyll A and B, brown algae chlorophyll A and C, and fucoxanthin. Red algae have phycocyanin, phycoerythrin, and chlorophyll A and D. They can store energy in different forms. They can have cell walls made of different compounds. So once again, while we use the term algae, algae vary. Green algae include unicellular forms, but brown algae include the kelps, which can be more than 100 feet long, 150 feet long. And so, once again, algae vary quite a great deal. Many of them are quite complex. Brown algae can be huge. Red algae can have quite complex reproductive structures. And so there's, great complexity there. Even among the green algae, some of them are single-celled, but some of them are colonial. So here you can see Volvox. This is a bowl of algae made of many cells. So some green algae, it's the single cell swimming around. Others, it's the colony. Spirogyra, pictured here, that's a colonial form which has which grows in a chain. That sea lettuce that you just saw, that's another colony. So this is a green alga which is single-celled, and then here's a green alga which is a colonial organism made of many cells. Okay. Now, green algae are important for lots of reasons, one of which is, as we will see, green plants evolve from them, all right? And so green algae do live on land. Not only do they live in terrestrial environments, but they can live in soil. They can, make tree bark look greenish. So green algae can live on land, and it's from the green algae on land that we get the first land plants. So red algae are cousins of green algae. They share some features, but not others. And then among the green algae, there are different kinds of green algae. Some are more closely related to land plants than others. So notice that here's a family tree. And so the family tree includes red algae as an early branch, then different kinds of green algae. And then one group of green algae is actually the cousin of the land plants, more closely related to land plants than other green algae are. And so, green algae are interesting, and, we can get back to them when we're talking about land plants and their origins. Red algae are often red, but they don't always have to be. They do have chlorophyll in them and can appear more of a greenish. So phycoerythrin, phycocyanin, these are reddish pigments, but they also have chlorophyll. And so while that one looked a little, looked more red, here is a red alga, which looks actually more green because, they can vary among themselves. Many of them have complex reproductive cycles. When I studied biology years and years ago, there was a group which was included with the fungi called slime molds, but now it's recognized they are not fungi. Instead, they are protists. And then as such, there's actually unrelated groups. So we can say, oh, that's a slime mold, that's a slime mold. You would think that, oh, because they're both slime molds, they're related. It turns out they're not. Just like unrelated groups of protists can be lumped together in the term algae, which isn't a biological group. It's just a cluster of groups, some of which are unrelated. The same then includes slime molds. So if you say, peel back, the bark on a rotting log, sometimes you'll see this beautiful network of filaments serving as decomposers. These would be slime molds. There are different kinds of slime molds. Some are unicellular, part of their life cycle, multicellular, others. And one of the things that slime molds can do is they can undergo cell division, but not make new cell walls. And so that while you have lots of cells there, they're not really separate. They kind of share their cytoplasm. And therefore, if you look under the microscope, you'll see that there's just all of this stuff flowing back and forth, almost like a current, because they have a lot of cells, but they just haven't separated them into separate boxes. So all the nuclei are kind of together, all of the cytoplasm is kind of together. And so now what you're looking at here is what's called cytoplasmic streaming, where you can just have, if this is a rotting log and all of these filaments are spreading throughout in it, you can just kind of have this movement of stuff going through the whole mass. So this is something which is called a slime mold. There's more, but we are winding down. There is a group of protists known as CHOANOFLAGELLATEs. They are a minor group, but they're of interest because this, more than any other group, are relatives of animals. And so if you're looking at the animal family tree and you ask who are the cousins, fungi aren't that distantly related, so fungi are close to animals. But this group called CHOANOFLAGELLATEs, they are a sister group of animals, more closely related to animals than any other eukaryotic group. Now we can say that because of genes. There's genes like the receptor tyrosine kinases, which animals and CHOANOFLAGELLATes share. And then if you notice, this video will be used again when I talk about sponges. So this is depicting a sponge, and notice that most of the sponge cells are called choanocytes. They look like this. Well, that looks an awful lot like these cells, which are CHOANOFLAGELLATes. They are not animals. They are their own separate cells. They can occur separately, or they can occur in small little colonies, small little bunches. And then we could ask, are these bunches of CHOANOFLAGELLATES is this kind of the precursor to the multicellular life of animals. So was it like cells like this that learn to live together, that is when the multicellular animals come from. So once again, CHOANOFLAGELLATES, they are a group of protists, but of interesting because they are the sister group of animals. Now, I've mentioned different forms of reproduction, so it's perhaps of importance just to focus on that for a second. Bacteria reproduce asexually. All right, they do not have sexual reproduction, and there are advantages to reproducing asexually. The population can grow more quickly. You can be by yourself and still reproduce, so you don't have to find a partner. Perhaps a storm has moved you to a different place than the rest of your population and you're by yourself. And so if you can reproduce asexually, you can still reproduce, but otherwise you would be then infertile if you only reproduced sexually. Also, if you have good genes, you can pass your good genes down to your offspring. Whereas in sexual reproduction, your offspring could actually get mutated genes which lessen their reproductive success because of your partner. So asexual reproduction, that was the original form of reproduction. And there are some eukaryotes where that's the only type of reproduction that we have observed in them, like euglenozoans only reproduce asexually. Dinoflagellates only reproduce asexually. Giardia seems to only reproduce asexually, although they do have genes for sexual reproduction. So apparently sexual reproduction is something that they once had and then lost. So there are advantages to asexual reproduction. There are disadvantages to sexual reproduction. So here, for example, from the female point of view, females often have to invest far more nutrition in a nutrient-rich egg, or that female snapping turtle had to migrate to where she was going to lay her eggs. Or in mammals, not only do the fetuses develop inside the body of the female, but also the milk is produced afterwards. And so from the female point of view, reproduction can often involve a much greater level of nutritional investment. From the male point of view, sexual reproduction can have disadvantages in that if two individuals are going to find each other, then very often one of them has to be more visually obvious, or has to make attention or draw attention. So in animals, it's often the males which are more brightly colored, the males which are making a courtship song, but that then opens them up to predation. So all of this being said, there are advantages to not reproducing sexually. There are disadvantages to both males and females in reproducing sexually. And so then one could ask, well, why did sexual reproduction evolve? And the answer is because it increases genetic diversity so much. If you have a population which has arisen through sexual reproduction, they vary. Now, the benefit of variation is that the world is going to change. There will be new parasites that appear. There will be new diseases. There will be new predators. The climate will change. It was only slightly more than 10,000 years ago that there was an ice age, and ice extended, from the North Pole to the place where I am now in northeastern Pennsylvania was covered by an ice sheet. All right, now, 10,000 years later, we're worried about global warming and sea level rising. In a world that varies, if you have variations in the population, odds are that now some members of the population will be able to survive. So that's the great benefit of sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction doesn't necessarily help each individual, but it helps the group, all right, because there's variation in the group. When something changes in the world, the new disease, the new predator, the climate change, some members of the group are likely now then to survive and thrive. In asexual reproduction, all individuals are essentially clones of each other, and anything that affects one organism badly could then potentially affect the whole group badly and have a negative um, effect. Now, I'm mentioning this now because it was the early eukaryotic cells that invented sexual reproduction. Sure, animals have added, for example, male and female anatomical structures, courtship songs, etc. But the basis of sexual reproduction is a nucleus which then has 2 copies of each chromosome, which undergoes a new type of cell division called meiosis, where it then splits to make cells which have haploid nuclei with 1 copy of each chromosome. And at some point, these haploid cells then fuse together again. That's the essence of sexual reproduction. And it was actually the early eukaryotes that evolved that. So eukaryotes, whether they be amoeba or paramecia, they can reproduce sexually, but then also the plants, fungi, and animals which evolved from early protists, they can reproduce sexually. A couple final points. One, I talked about symbiosis, relationships where organisms can benefit from each other. So if you were to look at the eggs of wood frogs, which are laid in spring, notice that a lot of them are green. Here you can have a green algae living in the egg masses. And it's a relationship in which both benefit. So the algae is producing oxygen that the embryo would like, and also then maybe even a little sugar, whereas the algae are benefiting, because they have a place to live, and then maybe getting nitrogen from the developing frog embryos. So here is a symbiosis between the eukaryotic green algae and frog embryos. And if you were to look inside, there's even ciliates in this frog mass. So frog eggs can actually be more complex with lots of ciliates. And then here is a reference to not only a symbiosis, like we just saw, but an endosymbiosis. So there is one type of green alga known as oophilia, which literally means the lover of eggs. It actually not only is associated with the eggs of an amphibian, where it helps, it actually lives inside amphibian cells. So female spotted salamanders can actually have a green alga living inside their cells that then they put into the egg masses which they lay. So here you notice the egg masses of spotted salamanders laid in this pond. And notice that they're green. Inside the body of the female was green algae. These green algae then lived inside the body or the egg masses. And then when the larvae develop, they then have green algae living inside themselves. So it's an endosymbiosis where the animals are giving the algae a place to live. Also, potentially nitrogenous waste, and the green algae need nitrogen. But now the green algae are producing oxygen as a waste product, which the developing larvae in the egg mass need. They rely on that oxygen and maybe sugar as well. And so not only is this a symbiosis, but also an endosymbiosis where algae are living inside the cells of here a vertebrate. So we know of this in invertebrates, so like corals have algae living inside their cells. That's an endosymbiosis. This, as far as I know, is the only known example of a vertebrate endosymbiosis, where here we have a microscopic algae living inside the cells of a vertebrate where they mutually benefit. A couple final points. In addition to the protists which we know of today, there are protists which are known in the fossil record, and we kind of clump them together in the group known as acritarchs. And if you're trying to study the fossil record, like when were there mass extinctions, when was there oxygen developing in Earth's history, that a lot of people who are studying the fossil record then study, the diversity of, these groups known as acritarchs. And we can say, oh, look, here was a mass extinction. It didn't just, affect, the animals. It then affected, microscopic life as well. Look at the acritarchs, these groups become extinct, and then the other groups then, take their place. All right. Last point is, what we like in biology is to have what are called monophyletic groups. So for example, dogs are a monophyletic group because once upon a time there were ancestral dogs, canids, and all of the dogs alive today are in the family Canidae. The family Canidae shares one common origin from the first dogs, and so therefore they form a monophyletic group. Cats are a monophyletic group. Protists simply aren't. And so here's the problem. We call some protists amoebas, all right? But amoebas actually have separate origins. Some of these are amoebas, but you can call some of these amoebas, you can call some of these amoebas. Algae have multiple groups. All right, so who's called algae? Well, the red algae are called algae, the green algae are called algae, but there's also algae, diatoms can be called algae, euglenids with photosynthesis inside them can be called algae. Some protists are called fungal-like, some protists are called slime molds, but they occur at different points in the family tree. And so this is a problem for biology because now algae don't represent a real group. Algae, evolve separately. Slime molds don't represent one group. And so therefore, if you were to ask, when did certain traits evolve? Among these eukaryotes, you can find traits which evolved distinctly, having separate origins, so they're not unique to a group. Even things like multicellularity, different members have become colonial, and then different members have become truly multicellular. And so here's the thing. These protists, we would love to now say that protist is a kingdom, but it's not, all right? For one reason is that, look here, that land plants, they evolved from green algae. So they're in this family tree. Fungi evolved from this branch and animals evolved from this branch. When we use the term protist, we are referring to eukaryotes, but not all of them. We're excluding land plants, we put them in one kingdom. We're excluding fungi, we put them in another kingdom. And we're excluding animals, we put them in another kingdom. So imagine, say, you have a family reunion and you invite everyone with your last name, but then you realize you've skipped some members, say they're, your sisters, your female cousins, they married and they changed their last name. They're part of the family. They're just as much descended from your parents, your grandparents as you are, but they now have a different name. They belong in the family reunion, but if you only invite people with your last name, you've excluded some members of your family. Same thing here. Plants are part of this family. Fungi and animals are part of their family. They are just as much descended from the first eukaryotes as are amoebas and dinoflagellates and green algae. But because we give them special names, you're a plant, you're a fungus, you're an animal, we tend to exclude them from the protistan kingdom. But then the protistan kingdom doesn't include all members of the family. So the name for this biologically is what's called a paraphyletic group. A paraphyletic group includes some, but not all of the members of the common ancestor. 2 billion years ago, there were eukaryotic cells, and the group which we call protists includes many diverse lineages descended from these early eukaryotic cells, but not all of them, because plants, fungi, and animals, they're kept separate. So as such, protists, it's not a perfect biological group. It's a paraphyletic group because it includes some, but not all of the descendants of the first eukaryotes. This has been an overview of protists. beginning with the first eukaryotes 2 billion years ago, and then the diverse lineages of protists today. Obviously, in the background, I've been playing these individual videos, which then go into many of these to a greater degree. At the end of the playlist, if you were to say, look in freshwater, so living in the Northeast United States, I can find, green algae, diatoms, euglenozoans, and then some other algae, so these heterocont algae. So you can, in addition to amoebas and paramecia, you can find a great diversity of protists in ponds around you.